tissues here feel stress, and that's where the collagen will bind down. So that's why sometimes if you've been holding your phone for a while and you stand up and you try to stretch, you feel really tight because all the tissues have bound down. So what I want to do is kind of go into that introduction of we have different types of muscle tissue in the body. Now, next one up is motor units. Motor units are what actually cause the muscle fibers to contract. How many of you out there have been doing like a heavy lift and you start feeling your muscles shaking? Or you hold an isometric pause, say you're holding a high plank for a period of time. What happens after you hold a high plank for a little bit, Abby?
You
what
fatigue.
Your muscles? What's that?
They start to shake.
They start to fatigue. They start to shake.
Yeah.
Well, where that shake is, what that shake indicates is you're activating more muscle motor units. As muscle fibers fatigue, they'll recruit new motor units. And a motor unit is what you see right there on the screen. A motor unit is the end of the nervous system that interacts with the fibers on a muscle fiber. So the motor unit is the end plate of the nervous system interacting with the muscle fibers. And that's what we're trying to turn on with exercise. And there are two ways to recruit muscle fibers. One is mechanical by using a heavier load. So if you're exercising at home, that might be an issue. But the second way to activate all muscle fibers is through a metabolic overload, is going to a point of fatigue. If you go to a point of fatigue, theoretically, you should be activating all fibers within the muscle. So two ways to activate more muscle fibers. One is use a heavier resistance. Two is working to a point of fatigue. And that gets us to the Acute program, the Acute variables of program design. How do you, because again, personal trainer hat, if Abby were my client and she came to me, she said, Pete, this is what I want to do. I want to work on my glutes. I need to keep Charlie happy. Charlie's my husband. I need to make sure I keep a smile on his face. So let's keep my tummy flat and my glutes round. To paraphrase your words, I'm not
I said fat. I said flat and fat is what I said.
I said flat. I said keep your tummy flat and your
butt fat.
And your butt round. But
yeah, go ahead.
What I would do is I would go to my chart. What's that?
It said P-H-A-T.
Exactly.
I
would go to my chart and I would look at what weight does this. I would try to train you in that 6 to 12 rep range.
Yeah.
Meaning I would try to have your muscles fatigue right in the middle, which builds volume, right? Because if you look in this table and you see volume, we see rep goal is 6 to 12. What that means is if you fatigue the muscle fiber by 6 to 12 reps, theoretically the muscle should compensate by getting bigger. One way that the muscle's getting bigger is by storing more glycogen. Going to muscle fatigue means you depleted all the glycogen stored in that type 2 muscle fiber. So that's one way the muscle fiber is going to get bigger, is by storing more glycogen. The second way it's going to get bigger is by repairing itself, by the tissue repair. So that's the idea, is that you want to be able to go to a point of fatigue if you want to get the muscles to activate all the way. Now, this is me as a personal trainer. As a personal trainer, I might do somewhere between 8 to 12 reps. If you can do a 13th or 14th rep, I'm going to add more weight because I want you to fatigue in a relatively short period of time. It's more comfortable to go to fatigue in 10 reps than it is in 30 reps. But when you teach group fitness, Abby, how to use this information with your group classes? Because I know you know the programming, but when you teach in a group format, I know people don't want to care. They don't care about X many reps. They just want to know that they're getting the workout. So how do you apply this information in your group training?
Yeah, it depends on what class it is. Because I know, like today, it's going to be, we're doing everything timed. So you're definitely going to be above a lot of the reps that you see for strength and even volume. But knowing my classes and knowing that most of the people don't, depending on what class it is, if it's a sculpt class, and I call sculpt, a lot of times it says strength on the schedule. We got that. It's not technically strength. You have people that are grabbing 5 pounds and 8 pounds. And how many reps are we actually doing in class? Are we fatiguing the muscle? Yes. Is there a lot of value to that? Absolutely. But if I want them to do, let's say, less volume, I want them to work on strength, like true strength or true volume without going into muscular endurance, what I would typically do is set up a circuit. And I don't mean it's, when we say circuit, because I know because right now circuit training, a little bit scary out there, because I know we've got to move from station to station. Sometimes you want them to stay in their own place, or maybe they're in their house. So what I do is I suggest the weight, and I tell them, maybe we're doing an AMRAP as an example. And what's an AMRAP? As many rounds as possible. So that means they're going to be doing multiple sets, and I tell them what I want them to feel by the 12th rep or by the 6th rep or whatever it is. And if they don't feel that, as you just mentioned, if they're not fatigued by that rep, then the next set they want to grab more weight. Because in an AMRAP, say they're doing a 6-minute AMRAP, maybe I choose 2 different movements. They're probably going to get through each exercise 3 times, so 3 sets. So they have the second and the third set where they can increase the load and accomplish the goal. So there's definitely a lot of ways that we can help them achieve some of these, these repetition goals, or not even repetition, but fatigue goals. Get them to the right place.
And I think that's a great way to look at it. I hadn't even thought about that, but that's exactly what we want to think about, is a fatigue goal. Because it's one thing to do a number of repetitions, but if you don't hit that point of fatigue, you're not recruiting, theoretically, you're not recruiting all the fibers in that muscle. And that's where we know we need to be really, we can be really creative. And that's the one thing, I don't know about you, but working out at home, I'll play around with, I have a couple kettlebells and a couple dumbbells, but what I'll do is I'll alternate between using like the dumbbells for a split leg squat and then do a single leg squat with no weight to really kind of fatigue the muscle fibers. Or then I'll even do a drop set of where maybe I start with reverse lunges to single leg squats and then go down the ground and do hip thrusts with my dumbbells to fully fatigue the muscles. So the whole idea is that we can put the body in a safer position while still working at fatigue. But that just gets you, if you understand this chart, you understand that really, if you're trying to get definition, if you're trying to get muscle strength, we just need to get to a point of fatigue. And whether you use a heavy weight for 1 or 2 reps, or whether you use a lightweight that's going to require you to do 25, 30 reps, the idea is still the same. The ability to not be able to do another rep to get to that point of fatigue, because that's what's going to initiate muscle growth. So how do muscles function? And this is where we kind of need to retrain again, get into different thought processes, right? We need to think of the body as one muscle. And now we need to think about the body of lengthening to shortening. And I learned this from Gary Gray years ago, is muscles lengthen to shorten. And a lot of times where we go wrong by this is a lot of times in exercise, we think of muscles shorten first. Like a lot of times if I'm demonstrating a squat, I'm demonstrating the concentric muscle shortening phase. If just like I did with the bench press, I demonstrate the concentric phase first. But in reality, and I'm going to angle my camera down here a little bit, you can see my couch and stuff. But in reality, when we look at the glutes, our glutes lengthen when we flex our hips. So when we flex our hips, we're actually lengthening the glutes, storing mechanical energy in them. So when the tissue lengthens, it's storing energy. So when it shortens, it returns that energy. And I'm going to demonstrate that again. So if you watch, if this right here is my hand, is kind of like my hamstrings and my glutes. When I hinge at my hips, those muscles are being lengthened. And then when they contract, boom, they bring me back to shortening. And when we look at the hip, we understand the hip moves in all 3 planes. So the glute is lengthened in all 3 planes. And that's why we're going to go into this and why it's so important. So when the leg is in front of the body, we have to look at what position the hip is in. The hip is flexed, it's slightly adducted in the frontal plane, and it's internally rotated in the transverse plane. So as the hip moves behind the body, what do you think happens? It goes from flexion to extension. The hip goes from being adducted to being abducted. And I'm showing you with my hand in the video. So you go from being adducted to abducted. And when the hip is in front of the body in the transverse plane, you go from being internally rotated to externally rotated. That's what is so important to understand with what the glutes do. So the glute is actually lengthened in all 3 planes of motion. When the leg is in front of the body, when the leg is here, the glute's being lengthened in the sagittal plane. When the leg is here across the midline, if I show you my left leg here, that glute's being lengthened in the frontal plane. And anytime you internally rotate, if you try this at home, if you put your hand right here on your glute and you step around, you can feel how those muscles lengthen to shorten. So that's really where we want to understand what the glute does in all 3 planes. The glute lengthens in flexion, it lengthens in adduction, adduction, and it lengthens in internal rotation. Because we want to create that lengthening, we want to go from lengthening to shortening in all planes of motion. And when we look at that takes us to this next idea. If we really want to understand what muscles do, we have to understand what they do in the gait cycle. Because those of you that have babies, you know this. The first thing that a baby does is does tummy time. Then the baby starts crawling and starts rolling over. That ties in. What's the gait action? Gait is shoulder and hips working together. Gait is shoulders and hips working together. That is what all these muscles are designed to do, is to make our body work as efficiently and as effectively as possible when we walk in gait. So if you understand what the glute does when you're walking, if you understand that the glute goes from lengthening to shortening, that the glute goes from lengthening to shortening, and it goes from lengthening to shortening, then you can create a number of different movements. To strengthen that. Here's a great view, and we're going to talk about what the gluteus maximus does in the sagittal plane. I've already talked, it decelerates flexion, so the muscles lengthen during flexion to accelerate extension. Now, if you take a look down, the other muscles on the back of the leg, and this is very important, the other muscles on the back of the leg that work with the glutes are the hamstrings and the adductors. And keep in mind, so we want to go back to all muscles function like they do during gait. And this is always a funny thing, and I don't know if you see me do this at conferences, Abbie, but I'll ask people, when was the last time you saw anybody walk like this? Nobody walks bringing their legs across the midline of the body, right? But if you walk, your thigh doesn't come across the front of your body. That's not what the adductors do. When we walk, our legs go from flexion to extension. So if you put your muscle right here, if you grab the back of your thigh, your adductors extend the femur. Your adductors are hip extensors. So if people really want to work on their inner thighs, they have to do a lot of flexion and extension exercises. And ideally, if they want to do that, they have to do single leg exercises, because that can be what really isolates in those tissues. But when we look at those, because I know a lot of people not only want to work on the glutes, but they want to work on those muscles on the back of the thigh. There's one reason why sprinters, volleyball players, and dancers all have nice legs, is because they use all those muscles together. So really, when we look at it, that's where we want to take that understanding. And this is from kinesiology in the musculoskeletal system, which shows you the moment arm. So for people that maybe have not seen this before, that's an important thing to see. Anything to add there, Abs?
No, what I was going to say was, and I love that you mentioned that, and maybe you want to say it again, is that I know people, you have a lot of, and mostly women, you don't see a lot of men sitting on the adductor machine. You don't see a lot of men lying on their side with one leg, with the top leg flipped over the bottom leg, you know what I'm talking about, and lifting the inside leg up and down. And I think you just mentioned this, and maybe just correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't want to, because I lose my concentration very quickly, which you probably know that. But you said the adductor works when you're doing, your inner thigh muscle works when you're doing single leg movements.
Yeah,
yes,
and Abbie, that's a great call out.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't realize that one of the primary, and I'll demonstrate here, one of the primary things you're doing in a single leg movement is that adductor is controlling the pelvis and the femur together. So that's really why I want to call it out, because a lot of people want to work on the adductors,
right,
the glutes, and if they're there doing these type of movements, well, that's not the way the adductors program to work.
Right.
So you're trying to basically, if you're on an abductor machine, if you're doing this, you're trying to run Google software on your Apple phone. It just is not going to work. It's not really what it's designed for.
Can I say one more thing too?
Please.
Yeah, and you go back to if you think about when someone's working their adductors, when they say, I want to work my inner thighs, what is their ultimate goal when they say that? They really want to make their inner thighs smaller. How many? You guys don't have to answer that question, but that's their goal. And how many times when you go back, there's two things. So the adductor machine, so you're doing what on the adductor machine? You're typically adding what? A couple of plates of weight to it. That's first. Never have I ever heard of anybody hypertrophying a muscle to make the area smaller. That's one. And two, go back to the Pilates ring. How many of you guys have ever used a Pilates ring out there? Yes, the Pilates. How many of you seen, when you first purchase them, they look like a nice little circle, right? A little O. And then after like a few uses, people squeeze those so hard they look like a misshapen egg. Like, what happened? Because they're trying to what? Make their inner thighs smaller. I'm like, doing strength training and fatiguing the muscle will never make the muscle or make that area smaller that we're talking about. So if we can make them function better, that's a whole different story. The whole area can work better by doing single leg movements.
No, and that's, you're right. You're speaking to, I had an article come out a couple months ago for ACE on the benefits of unilateral training and single leg training. And again, the hamstrings, a lot of people, where a lot of people don't realize with the hamstrings is the hamstrings are most active. And I got to tilt my camera down here. The hamstrings are most active right before the left foot hits the ground. So right here, when you walk, the hamstrings actually help extend the knee. So right before the foot hits the ground, the hamstrings are being lengthened. And then as you step over that foot, the hamstrings attach to the tibia and they help pull that tibia back. So if you really want to think about, so I'm going to demonstrate this. So if I'm doing like a hip hinge and I'm coming up like this, if I think about pulling my pelvis down, at the same time I pull my knee back, I'm going to use my hamstrings and my adductors a little bit more effectively because I'm recruiting them to do exactly what they're designed to do. Move the pelvis, engage the femur, and work the hip and the knee together. And the reason why I point that out is you can get more gluteal activation. Anytime people are standing up, they can get more contraction and more gluteal activation by pushing that ground away from them. By pushing their feet into the floor, you activate more of the posterior chain that gets all those muscles, engaged. Because if you understand where the muscles attach and how they go from point A to point B, then you can be a little bit more specific with how you engage it. So what we're going to do